Need some help with your introductions and conclusions? Well, you are in the right place. So for the next few minutes, I'll go over some of the same things that I went over in class to help you improve your introduction and conclusion. It might be a little weird to write your introduction and conclusion last, but it really makes sense. You can't introduce something that you haven't written, so make sure at this point you pretty much have the body of your speech written, rehearsed, timed, and everything is ready to go. Then you work on your introduction. Your introduction sets the tone of your speech and obviously introduces your topic to your audience. So go ahead and get out your packet and turn to page 16 for an introduction and page 17 for a conclusion, and we'll get started. So here's some basic information about an introduction. First, they include 4 parts: an attention getter, credibility statement, connection to the audience, and preview. Secondly, they make up about 10% of your speech. So for a 4 to 6 minute speech, your introduction will be about 24 to 36 seconds. That is not a lot of time. So remember that, 24 to 36 seconds. And lastly, a lot of you will write almost all of it out on your speaking notes. You might not want to write it out word for word, but a lot of it will be written out because this is when you're going to be the most nervous and might forget something. So now let's take a look at attention-getting devices. So it's pretty clear the first thing you have to do is get our attention. And look over your keyword and make sure that your attention-getting device matches the point of your speech or what your keyword is. So it should really connect to that. But let's take a look at 5 different ways that you can get our attention. All right, so the first way is by using a startling statement. And this is something that's unexpected, that surprises the audience. I've had students play the guitar, sing, play the fiddle. I had a student give a speech on wedding traditions, and he broke a plate against the wall underneath where the dry erase board is. Not a good idea. It just created a huge mess. So be careful with those attention-getting startling statements. Probably the most common way is the second way, and that's a rhetorical question. And a rhetorical question is a question that you don't expect to have anyone answer it. It's just a question that prompts thinking. So don't wait for an answer because it often backfires and your audience doesn't answer it, or they answer it wrong, or they take it over. All right, a third way to start your speech is with a story. And this is actually pretty popular. It needs to be a short story. Remember, 24 to 36 seconds for your entire introduction. Make sure you relate it to the audience and use a story that pulls the audience in. So it should not always be like totally about you unless you think something that we would be interested in. All right, fourth is suspense. This is a really effective tool for topics that people might perceive as boring. So you can almost trick us into listening. But remember, again, keep it short or we might lose interest and eventually just be like, whatever, get to your point. And the last is a famous quotation. This is not very common, but you can start with a famous quotation. It does need to have value. It does need to be relevant. It shouldn't just be some random thought. All right, so you've got our attention. Next thing you need to do is somewhere in your introduction, connect the topic to the audience. What some of my students will do, they'll combine it with their attention-getting device. If you ask a rhetorical question or say something like, a lot of you have probably wondered, or you've been to the store and you've seen whatever. So by using the word you or we as students or something like that, that's a great way to connect the topic to the audience. Another thing you need to do in your introduction is establish credibility. We need to know that you do know what you're talking about. There are 2 ways that you can do this. One is you can cite specific research. So look up those handouts that I gave you, those PDFs that you can download in the public speaking help section of Padlet. but you can say something like according to, or I spoke with, that type of thing. You don't want to say I conducted extensive research. It needs to be specific research. The second way that you can do this is cite your own expertise, but you do need to be a big deal, not just that you're giving a speech on Cancun and you vacationed in Cancun. So I've had students who are on the track team, and they will say things like, as an avid runner and member of the Mansfield University track team, I buy shoes and blah, 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 and they're giving a speech on 3 things to look for when you buy a pair of running shoes. So let's wrap up our introduction, and we do this with a preview. The preview goes last. It has to go last. It just helps us remember the main points and follow your speech. But all a preview is just where you list your main points. It's a simple, clear, brief statement. And by the way, don't say, so today I'm going to talk about, or something like that. That tends to make your introduction really choppy. So it might take a while to figure out how to work into your preview. It's not always easy. So for my speech on the movies that the Beatles are famous for, I could say something like this. I know a lot of you are familiar with the music that the Beatles made, but are you familiar with the movies that they made? Well, little do you know, the Beatles are famous for 3 movies, Help, A Hard Day's Night, and Yellow Submarine. So now let's take a look at Help. So did you notice that last little part where I introduced the first main point? That's a great way to end your introduction. Okay, so now you've got your introduction. The easy part is writing your conclusion, because it's just basically a shorter version of your introduction. So make sure you look at page 17 in your packet, and let's get started. So here's some basic information about a conclusion. First of all, like the introduction, there are 4 parts, and those are, you'll tie it back into the attention getter, you have a review, you reconnect it to the audience, and you have a closing statement. Secondly, these are shorter than an introduction, so about 5% of your total speech. So in this case, for these speeches, they'll be about 15 to 20 seconds, so make sure you time it. And lastly, you will write a lot of this out because you're going to be really excited to finish this thing and you might forget something. Okay, so now let's take a look at conclusions. The conclusion's pretty easy to write, so look at your introduction and start from there. The first thing I recommend doing, this does not need to come first, but I think it's a lot easier, is for you to refer back to your attention getter. So if you started with a rhetorical question, refer back to that rhetorical question by saying something like, so now when I ask you, that brings the speech full circle. Secondly, you need to reconnect to the audience. Just remind us how this connects to us. And again, look at your introduction for guidance. But what can we do with this new knowledge? And I could say something like, for my Beatles speech, so the next time you listen to the Beatles, something like that, blah, blah, blah. You'll need a review in there, which is like your preview, just in the conclusion. So you state your main points and you keep it really simple. So I could say something like, so Help, A Hard Day's Night, and Yellow Submarine are all movies that showcase the Beatles' talent. Repeating that just helps us remember the content of your speech, which is what a speech is all about, remembering information. The last thing you need to put in is a closing statement. This clearly has to go last, but it's just a simple statement so the audience knows you're done. You can pause and slow your delivery, and I would say something like, so, see you at the movies. Now let's spend a little bit of time talking about common mistakes in introductions and conclusions. First of all, don't apologize. I have students who do this in both the introduction and conclusion. You don't need to apologize, even if you aren't feeling well or you're worried. Just get up there and start your speech or just finish your speech. A second problem is not adhering to the time limit and going on and on and on. What you need to do is check to make sure if you are an adder-oner or a taker-awayer. And what I mean by that, are you the type of person that when you practice, you keep adding things or you keep taking things away? And you want to adjust accordingly and stick to your notes. Another problem is just choppy, disconnected parts. The whole introduction and conclusion should flow really well. And like I mentioned before, in the introduction, the attention getter has to go first and the preview has to go last. And it's really a good idea if you can kind of combine the other two elements. And in a conclusion, the only thing that you need to do in a particular order is just to make sure your closing statement is last. Next, keep the material only focused on what you talked about. So don't be adding things into your introduction or conclusion that you didn't cover in your speech. Another problem is reading your entire introduction or conclusion. Be familiar with it, but when you start your speech, look at your audience, and when you end your speech, be looking at your audience. And just two pet peeves with introductions and conclusions. And the first one is saying, today I'm going to talk about, or ending your speech with in conclusion. Don't do either one of these. When we end our speech with in conclusion, usually the audience stops listening, so don't do that. So end strong, be loud, and be looking at the audience. So that about wraps it up with introductions and conclusions. If you have any questions, feel free to stop by my office during office hours, or you can send me an email and we can schedule it at another time. I'll see you in class.